Touch your car's bumper today, and you'll feel it immediately, a hollow, forgiving give, thin plastic that flexes and creaks, engineered not to protect but to survive a parking lot tap without a ticket in small claims court. Now think back, or picture in your mind, the bumper on a 1965 Impala or a 1968 Mustang. Solid. Cold to the touch even in summer. Chrome-plated steel with the heft of a hand weight, bolted directly to the frame like it meant something. That bumper wasn't an accessory. It was armor, sculpture, and promise all at once, a promise that this machine was built to outlast the person driving it. Somewhere between those two bumpers, something died. Not just a material, not just a manufacturing process, but a philosophy. And today we're going to trace exactly when it happened, why it happened, and what America lost the day Detroit stopped believing in steel. It's easy to blame the 70s for everything. Bad haircuts, brown appliances, disco. But nowhere did that decade leave a deeper scar than on the driveway, on the boulevard, on the very shape of what a car was allowed to be. Because sometime around 1971, the federal government looked at the American automobile, an object that had spent 3 decades becoming a rolling piece of folk art, and decided it needed a bumper standard. Just a bumper standard. That's how it always starts. A small, reasonable-sounding regulation, buried in a government registry, that nobody in Detroit thought would matter all that much. But it mattered. It mattered more than almost anyone in Motor City ever wanted to admit. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, fresh off a decade of consumer advocacy pressure and a growing national anxiety about insurance costs, introduced bumper impact standards that required cars to withstand a 5-mile-per-hour collision without damage to safety equipment. On paper, it sounds sensible. Nobody wants a headlight busting out because someone tapped your fender at a stop sign. But the way that standard got implemented changed the entire skeleton of the American automobile, and it happened almost overnight, in engineering terms. Suddenly, those beautiful chrome bumpers, the kind that wrapped around a car's nose like a smile, the kind that could take a hit and just laugh it off, had to be re-engineered with shock-absorbing mounts, hydraulic pistons, and eventually, thick plastic covers to hide all that new machinery underneath. The elegant simplicity of solid steel gave way to a Rube Goldberg contraption of springs and foam, wrapped in a plastic shell designed to look clean, but built to disguise complexity, not celebrate craftsmanship. And here's the part that really stings if you love the golden age of American design. Those big protruding rubber-tipped battering ram bumpers of the mid-70s weren't even the endgame. They were the awkward teenage phase. The industry knew, even then, that steel and chrome were headed for extinction, and they spent the next 15 years quietly, deliberately replacing them with something cheaper, lighter, and infinitely more disposable, plastic. Not because plastic was better, because plastic was easier to mold into whatever shape a regulation demanded, easier to color match to a body panel, easier to repair with a heat gun instead of a body shop's dolly and hammer set, and dramatically cheaper to produce at scale. What started as a safety mandate became, by the 80s, a wholesale materials revolution that reshaped what a car was allowed to be, and more importantly, what a car was allowed to feel like. Because that's really what we're talking about here. Feel. Weight. Presence. A 1962 Cadillac didn't just look substantial, it felt substantial. You closed the door and it shut with a sound like a bank vault. You leaned on the fender and it didn't budge, didn't flex, didn't creak, it just held you, the way a good piece of furniture holds you, built from materials that assumed you'd still be using it decades later. That's not an accident. That's not nostalgia talking. That's actual physics. Steel has mass. Chrome has depth. When light hits a properly plated bumper from the golden age, it doesn't just reflect, it pools, it curves with the metal, it creates this liquid shimmer that plastic, no matter how well it's painted, simply cannot replicate. Because plastic is flat. Plastic is thin. Plastic, by its very chemical nature, is trying to weigh less, cost less, and last less. And it succeeded on all 3 counts. This is where the real tragedy of the transition reveals itself, because it wasn't just an aesthetic downgrade, it was a fundamental redefinition of what a car was supposed to be to its owner. For the better part of the 20th century, American automobiles were built with a kind of implicit permanence. Not literal immortality, cars still rusted, still broke down, still got traded in, but there was a design philosophy baked into every rivet and weld that assumed longevity. Steel bodies were meant to be repaired, not replaced. A dent could be hammered out. A rust spot could be patched, welded, sanded, repainted. The car was treated like a piece of property you'd maintain for the long haul, the way you'd maintain a house or a piece of good furniture, something that could be handed down, something that could become an heirloom. Plastic broke that entire relationship. You can't hammer out a crack in a polyurethane bumper cover the way you'd hammer out a dent in steel. You can't weld a fractured plastic fender. When these new lightweight composite panels failed, and they failed constantly, fading in the sun, becoming brittle in the cold, cracking under stress that steel would have simply absorbed, the only real solution was replacement. Not repair. Replacement. In that single shift, from a culture of repair to a culture of replacement, rippled outward into the entire American relationship with the automobile. Cars stopped being treated like lifelong companions and started being treated like appliances. Like something you use until it's inconvenient, then discard for a newer model. The industry didn't just change what cars were made of, it quietly, deliberately changed how long we were supposed to love them. And you can see this shift most clearly if you think about what a car actually looked like after 10, 15, 20 years under each philosophy. A well-kept 1957 Chevy Bel Air, even decades later, wears its age with a kind of dignity. The chrome might need polishing. The steel might have a little surface rust in the wheel wells. But it ages the way a good leather jacket ages, developing character, developing what collectors and craftsmen call patina, a quality that actually makes the object more interesting, more valuable, more alive with history. Now think about a 1985 sedan with those plastic bumper covers. 10 years in, the plastic has already started to yellow, to fade unevenly depending on sun exposure, to develop these ugly hairline stress cracks radiating out from the mounting points. It doesn't age with dignity. It ages the way a lawn chair ages, sitting out in the yard too long, going brittle and chalky and sad. There's no patina in plastic. There's only decay. And that difference, dignified aging versus ugly decay, tells you almost everything you need to know about which era actually respected the object it was creating. Now, to be fair, and we should be fair here, because this isn't really a story about evil executives twirling mustaches, there were real pressures pushing the industry toward plastic beyond just the bumper standards. The 1973 oil crisis hit right as this transition was accelerating, and suddenly fuel economy wasn't just a marketing point, it was a matter of national anxiety. Every pound mattered. A steel bumper assembly could weigh well over 100 pounds when you counted the reinforcement brackets and shock mounts. A plastic and foam equivalent might weigh a third of that. Multiply that weight savings across every panel, every trim piece, every component that could plausibly be molded instead of stamped, and you start to understand the economic and regulatory logic that made plastic almost inevitable. Corporate average fuel economy standards, introduced in 1975, put direct pressure on manufacturers to shed weight everywhere they possibly could, and plastic was, in the cold calculus of an engineering department, simply a superior material for that specific goal. But here's what gets lost in that purely rational explanation, the part that never shows up in the government registries or the corporate engineering memos. Somewhere in that transition, something intangible got sacrificed for something measurable. Fuel economy is measurable. You can put a number on it, chart it, regulate it, put it on a window sticker. But the feeling of leaning against a solid steel fender on a warm summer evening, the sound of a heavy steel door closing with authority, the way sunlight actually danced across chrome instead of just sitting flat on painted plastic, none of that shows up on a spec sheet. None of that could be regulated into existence or engineered back in once it was gone. And so it simply vanished, decade by decade, replaced by something lighter, cheaper, more efficient, and almost entirely soulless. This is exactly the transformation that gutted American cruising culture, whether anyone at the time fully understood what was happening. Cruising, the whole ritual of it, the slow parade down the boulevard, windows down, engine rumbling, chrome catching the last light of a summer evening, it wasn't just about the driving. It was about the machine itself being worthy of display. You didn't cruise Van Nuys Boulevard or Woodward Avenue in something disposable. You cruised in something that felt like a rolling piece of American sculpture, something with weight and presence and craftsmanship, something that turned heads because it deserved to turn heads. The steel-bodied cars of the 50s and 60s weren't just transportation, they were public art, built by people who genuinely believed a car should be beautiful, should be substantial, should be built like it mattered. When the plastic era arrived, that belief didn't just fade, it was legislated and engineered out of existence, replaced by a new philosophy where a car was simply a checklist of regulatory compliance items wrapped around an engine. And maybe that's the real desecration here, not the material itself. Plastic isn't inherently evil, but the philosophy that material represented. The shift from building objects meant to be loved for decades to building objects meant to be used for a few years and forgotten. From artisanal weight to actuarial efficiency. From rolling sculpture to disposable module. Every time you see one of those late 70s or early 80s sedans with the big rubber-capped battering ram bumpers, understand that you're looking at the exact moment the American automobile stopped trying to be beautiful and started trying to merely comply. And every time you see a perfectly restored 1962 Bel Air or a 1966 Mustang gliding down a boulevard with its chrome bumper catching the evening sun, understand that you're looking at the last true generation of cars built not just to move people, but to move something in them. That weight you feel when you touch that old steel, that's not just metal. That's the ghost of a design philosophy that once believed cars deserve to be beautiful, deserve to last, deserve to be loved. And somewhere around 1974, with a stack of federal regulations and an oil crisis and a balance sheet full of weight reduction targets, America quietly decided that belief simply cost too much.